Okay, great, thanks. All right, welcome back to phase 2. So what we will talk about is some stuff about color, and then how to handle more complexity than what you can do in a single static visual representation. All right, so we talked quite a bit about the left side of this diagram before. Also, just to check on the microphone, can people hear me in the back? Okay, great. So, and now let's actually talk about the right side of this. So beyond space, what else can we do? Because there were a lot of those visual channels that I showed at the beginning. So I'm going to focus particularly on color, because color is something that is extremely powerful, extremely flexible, and extremely easy to use poorly. So with great power comes great responsibility. We need to learn about color. So first of all, when I say color, I actually mean three things: luminance, saturation, and hue. And so let me say in more detail what I mean by that. Color, one of the reasons it's so hard to use is that you can break it down into three channels. One of them is an identity channel, and the other two are magnitude channels. And this is a fundamental reason why it's so easy to get things wrong. So hue is a very, very strong categorical cue where you say things like, oh, the orange thing versus the blue thing. They are very much categorical. Grayscale, like luminance, is something where and saturation, right? You can talk about pink being in between white and fully saturated red, and gray is in between white and black. And everyone will reliably and repeatably do that. If you give them 3 paint chips, one's purple, one orange, and one blue, and say put them in order, who knows what people will generally put them in random orders, but they will always actually order correctly things that are different in luminance and saturation. So what are some of the implications of this fact? One is that if you are ever tempted to say things like, oh, in a computer graphics system, because of the characteristics of hardware and how displays work, I can separately encode things in R and G and B. It is true that RGB gives you all perceivable colors in a computer-based display, but unfortunately it's a terrible way to encode information because it doesn't match up with the perceptual characteristics of humans. So in general, it's much safer to think about color as luminance, hue, and saturation than as red, green, and blue when you're designing things. It's perfectly reasonable to convert back into RGB for display, but don't think about encoding that way. Remember the example I gave you of the not separable, very integral percepts of changes in R and G. So don't try to encode 3 different things using the RG and B channels. It can be a lot safer, I mentioned, to think about hue in a very different way than saturation and lightness, or rather luminance. But there's one thing I want to warn you about, which is that one of the other common color systems which you get in computer tools these days is very temptingly named HSL. But the L in these systems is actually lightness, not luminance. And it turns out that that matters. So what's nice about the HSL system is it's actually somewhat following this breakdown. You can really think of hue as a separate thing from saturation and lightness. And in this diagram here, as you go, what we see is fully saturated hues are on the outside, and then you're going down this gradient of saturation towards this 0 saturation point in the middle, which is white. So the H and the S is actually good. It's more perceptually based, but it's actually a pseudo-perceptual system. It's not a true perceptual system, because lightness in this system is actually not true luminance. And so let's talk about why that's a problem. Well, here we actually, if you're thinking of in RGB colors, and we think about the corners of that color cube, here we see these 6 different swatches of color. Now, here's an interesting point, which is that the way the human eye responds to different colors is highly wavelength dependent. And the amount of brightness or luminance that we see depends on where we are along that color spectrum. So the true luminance values of these different hues are actually quite different. In the standard way of converting from RGB to HLS, or HSV, which is a relative hue saturation value, these different colors are actually converted to the same grayscale value, which is not at all how they are perceived to your eye. Your eye perceives the yellow as much, much brighter than blue. So it turns out that there's some trickiness about actually doing thinking in luminance, But a crucial thing about luminance is this is actually how the eye detects things like edges. Basically, your edge detectors are luminance-based. They're grayscale. It's hard to get subtle changes in color to actually portray things. That's one reason why we typically have black text on a white background for maximum legibility. So you need luminance contrast to get fine-grained detail. So where does all of this leave us? Let's think about uses of color to actually convey information. So for one thing, there's typically we want to think about changes of hue to show categorical differences. And we can also then use colors to either show sequential data or diverging data where there's a 0 point going to something high and low versus going just from a min to a max. So let's think about these possible color map designs. Well, we can say, all right, we just have categorical colors. We just want to show differences. We can have some kind of sequential color scale going from min to max. This is an example that's just grayscale. We can have diverging where we've got some neutral point and go to fully saturated of one color or another. These are all quite safe color maps. We can also start to say, well, what if we want to have bivariate color maps where we're actually trying to encode two different attributes using color, which is very, very tempting because there's all those colors out there. So let's think about where we can do this safely and not so safely. It's fairly safe to have differences of hue and then basically have a high saturation version and a low saturation version. So in that sense, what we've got is one of those two things we're just using as a binary attribute, low and high. That is fairly safe. And we can do something similar with the diverging color map where we can have a high and a low saturation. Things start getting a little trickier when we try to combine categorical and sequential. People can, to a certain extent, use these kinds of color maps. People have done a fair number of experiments on actually seeing how humans respond to these more elaborate bivariate color maps, and unfortunately, we don't do so well on them. So despite having careful legends explaining how you're using the color, in general, this is territory where you have to be pretty cautious, and you will often find that people are not interpreting color in quite the way you would hope. So in general, my advice on color today is going to be a bit negative, which is a lot of what you hoped you could do with color doesn't work quite as well as you might hope. And often one of your goals will be to have your immediate intuition for color coding possibly be offloaded into other channels or other methods, which we'll be talking about. So do use bivariate color maps with quite a lot of care. Another thing to note is that Brewer is actually the creator, Cynthia Brewer, of a pretty fantastic site called Color Brewer, which can be a great resource for getting color maps that are actually both colorblind safe, web safe. So there's quite a bit that she has on her site, which is Color Brewer, and there's a reference to that at the end. So how do these colors interact with each other? So first of all, I already mentioned that size matters with color. And it's much harder to perceive color in smaller regions than larger regions. So in general, if you've got a small region, you need really highly saturated colors. But then the flip side is also true. If you're going to have really large regions that are colored, it generally blows your eyes out if those are very highly saturated colors. So if you're going to use large areas of color, you typically want lower saturation, and small regions need high saturation. So you need to design with some care there. The other thing to note is that there's a lot fewer bins than you might like for saturation and luminance. You can maybe get away with 3 or 4 levels, distinguishable bins in these. You're not going to be able to have someone reliably distinguish something like 10 levels of saturation, for example. The other thing to note is, for one thing, saturation and luminance are actually doing quite a bit of interference with each other. So you don't want to separately try to encode something with luminance and with saturation, because they'll have some similar visual effects. And if you then add transparency to the mix, unfortunately, that is also in that same category of highly interfering. So you can pick one of transparency, saturation, and luminance typically. You can't encode separate things with all 3 of those. What are other ways to go wrong? Categorical color, you don't get to use nearly as many colors as you wish. So in particular, the human eye is completely fantastic at noticing, for 2 things right next to each other, very subtle differences of color. And that's a fact that misleads many people. because what they don't think about is the fact that if you have colors scattered all over the screen in a bunch of small non-contiguous regions, we're actually quite terrible at reliably distinguishing colors. So this figure from a biology paper, sadly, is a case in point. And so let's start on the right, where what they're doing is they're color coding the relationship between stuff that appears on the mouse genome and the human genome. And if we look at what basically is acting as a legend, which is this part on the right with the mouse, you can tell the difference, even between a pretty subtle change between like chromosomes 6 and 7 on the mouse, certainly between 5 and 6, between 9 and 10. Because there's nothing in between them but a bit of neutral white, you can actually distinguish these. Now, let's start counting how many distinguishable colors there are on the right. So tan, greenish, that's maybe that same green, reddish, white, maybe blue, maybe purple, light blue, some other bluish thing perhaps, starting to run out. You know, maybe there's a brown versus the red. But these subtle distinctions between the greens we're not actually getting because these have a lot of other colors in between them in space. So we're basically doing the equivalent of binning these many colors down to about 8 or so. So in general, the advice is do the binning yourself deliberately. If you've got 20 things and you want to color code them, decide in advance what are the 8 bins to turn them into and do that explicitly and computationally, because otherwise people's eyes are going to do that for you. Because if it turns out that you really want them to be able to tell the difference between chromosome 11 and chromosome 19, which they can do really easily, but in fact it's equally important to distinguish between chromosomes 7 and 8, then this color map is not succeeding. So you can either explicitly bin down into a smaller number of colors. You can use other channels besides color. Maybe you can use combinations of, say, color and orientation and size coding. Maybe you can do some interesting things with the use of space. You can use multiple views, as we'll talk about later. But in general, be aware that almost everyone wants to use more categorical colors than the eye can get away with. The other thing to remember is when I'm talking about between 6 and 12 bins, typically, is one of those colors is the background. Often one of those colors is your main thing. One of those colors is a highlight color of I just put the mouse over that and I want to distinguish it. And so suddenly we're down from, say, 12 to 9 in terms of the other things you're thinking of as wanting to color code. And that's typically the best case. So that's a bit of a grim story about categorical color. What else do we need to worry about? Rainbows are dangerous. Many people think that because rainbows appear in the sky, after all, it's physics, that it must be perceptually good. But the physics does not match with the biology of humans here. And so let's talk about what the problems are with the rainbow. For one thing, I mentioned that experiment where if I take a red chip and a green chip and a purple chip and a blue chip and I ask you to arrange them, many of you will come up with different orderings. So they are not intrinsically ordered in a perceptual way. So hue is unordered is one problem. But there's also this nonlinearity. If I take a little region of this, let's say from here to here, I can actually see, okay, there's red and there's orange and there's yellow. So this little region gives me distinguishable about 3 colors. Let's take that same size region right about there. Green, green, and green. So we are not getting that kind of distinction. There is a very nonlinear response in the human eye to things like brightness and color. So certain regions of the rainbow have a lot of transitions and others really don't. So this nonlinearity is a major problem along with the unordering. So what's good about the rainbow? Well, for one thing, let's look at this picture. It's nice to be able to talk about the red stuff versus the green stuff versus the blue stuff versus the green stuff. Having nameable hues in regions actually allows you to think and talk about the data in a useful way. So there's a benefit to trying to see this very fine-grained structure of the data. But I think this is a nice example of some of the dangers of the rainbow color map. Does anyone know what this data is showing? Yeah, there's a lot of yellow there. Let's think about an alternative to the rainbow. So here's an example where for this, which is actually showing a spatial data set, there's a lot of this structure in terms of these waves we're seeing when we have a simpler color map with a neutral color in the middle of gray, and we've got the yellow and the purple, and you're actually seeing a lot of the larger scale structure here with these fewer hues. It's much harder to talk about, say, we're not so much seeing this red versus this yellow, because that all looks like fully saturated yellow, but we're seeing much more of the large-scale structure. So there's this trade-off here between the large-scale structure and the small-scale structure. As it turns out, it's Florida. But we were unable to see these coastline changes because of a, granted, deliberately pessimal putting of that 0 point exactly where we can least distinguish. Here's a carefully designed color map that's got a clear segmentation point at that 0 point, going down into the blue into dark for ocean, and then up into the whites for the terrain, and we're actually able to see that structure better. So what if you want to have your cake and eat it too? You want multiple distinguishable colors, and yet you want some ordering, which is the very common case with scientific data. So the big word version of what we want is multiple hues with monotonically increasing luminance. Let me break that down. So it's allowable to have multiple hues if you carefully order them so that they're in luminance order. So you don't put the yellow one in the middle, for example, because yellow is the high luminance. So there's a quite nice color map library out there, Viridis. There's a version for R and a version for Python that is actually an example of a quite nice thing that gives you multiple hues, but has carefully been designed so that it's low luminance on the bottom going all the way up through to high luminance on the top. And there's a URL for that resource at the end of this section as well. Now, let me mention rainbows are not always terrible. In particular, they're perfectly good if you've already binned your data into a small number, or you have intrinsically categorical data where you actually don't need to try to communicate order, because hue is actually fantastic for showing categorical data. And in that case, you want sort of maximum distinguishability, so you really do want a distribution, and this particular distribution of the rainbow is actually quite well suited. So it's not that all rainbows are bad, it's that rainbows to show ordered data are typically not your best choice. All right, I've decided that given the time, I'm not going to go deeply into colorblind questions, but if we have time at the end, I will come back to colorblindness. But the short answer is that, let me actually skip ahead, that color bluer.
Ask how many colorblind people there are here.
Well, yeah, and the question is how many are there and how many know you are? How many people know you are colorblind? All right, given the stats, I strongly suspect there might be a few more of you who always wondered, why are other people acting in this way that's a bit incomprehensible? But this tool, Color Bluer, is one of the better tools for actually generating reasonable color maps. There's also a tool out there, VizCheck, which allows you to actually check and see what things look like with different forms of colorblindness. And there's some more recent ones as well. But going back a bit to other channels, I've talked a lot about color because it's one of the most powerful and misused channels. Let me briefly mention some of the characteristics of these other channels. So we are very good at noticing length coding. We are definitely not so good, but sort of okay at judging areas. We're quite poor at judging volumes, so be aware of that. With angles, another thing to be aware of is that our accuracy is nonlinear. We're very good at noticing if something is exactly horizontal or a little bit off, or exactly vertical or a little bit off, or even exactly at that 45 degree. So you can tell the difference between a 45 degree angle and a 44 degree angle. You can't tell the difference between 37 and 38 degrees. So you can tell 90 from 89 and 0 from 1 and 45 from 44, but not these others. So be aware that there's these interesting nonlinear accuracies with the cardinal directions and the diagonals. What else is happening with shape? When I say shape, I am actually dramatically oversimplifying from a perceptual point of view. There's been a huge amount of work in human vision on trying to understand essentially how people are perceiving shape. For the purposes of visualization, we're taking all of this complexity and just lumping it into this question of, well, we can try to shape code points, essentially. There's a lot more under the hood there. The short answer is there are many distinguishable shapes. But certainly as they start getting closer and closer to each other, they get less distinguishable. So for your purposes, think of it as maybe a little bit more powerful than categorical color in terms of you can maybe start to see well over a dozen shapes that are quite small, even in a distinguishable way. Motion is another one with both great power and great responsibility. The good thing about motion is it's very, very, very noticeable. That's also the bad thing about motion. So in particular, if you've got a bunch of static visual cues like position and color and so on, and you really want to draw their attention to something, having something that moves a bit as some kind of highlighting is very, very effective. We will talk about reasons you would want to use that sledgehammer when you have multiple views and you've selected something in one view and you want it to be noticeable, its corresponding thing in the other view, where your eye is not currently looking because you're looking where you selected the first one. Then you might want to use this extremely powerful thing of some kind of motion. But the use with care part is that if you want them to be able to attend to any other cue, you probably don't want to use motion, because any of you who remember the bad old days of the web, when the blink tag was more popular than it is today, your eye can't actually look away from motion. You've actually got a peripheral vision system specifically designed to keep tigers from attacking you in the savannah, and it means that motion actually draws your attention visually. So it's so separable, it's basically unignorable. So as opposed to the separable versus integral ones where we could see you could separately attend to either position or color and distinguish between them and just direct your attention, the problem with these motion-based tags is they're basically a priority override that you can't easily just attend to the other ones for. So particularly dangerous with any kind of static coding, but if you're doing something transitional with highlighting in a way that's interactive, you could consider it. Okay, so more about these as well. Here specifically is a link to the new Viridis color map, which was originally introduced in R, but I know is now used quite a bit in Python as well. Okay, any quick questions about color or channels before we march along? So, we've been talking about ways of visually encoding information that is completely static, with the small exception of the motion stuff. And now what I want to do is talk about, well, how does interaction change the picture? What can we do besides simply draw a static picture? And what's interesting here? And what's hard? So I'm going to focus on these as an example of handling complexity. We've already heard about one strategy for handling complexity, which is deriving new data to show. But there are really three more major strategies for handling complexity. And one is, generally speaking, interaction. Some way, any way, to change the view over time. And that, in some ways, is the obvious way, and we'll be talking a bit about the less obvious ways and why we might sometimes choose them instead, which is to facet your data across multiple views, or within a single view to reduce the amount of stuff you're showing, either by reducing the number of items or reducing the number of attributes. So we'll be walking through these four ways of handling that. In fact, we've already talked quite a bit about the deriving way. So this idea of manipulating a view, some kind of interactive change over time. Necessarily, if we're going to have something that changes over time, we often have some idea of selecting some item of interest within that view. Essentially, all of navigation, panning and zooming and rotating, that's all thinking about the metaphor of a camera as something that you're moving. And so it's a subset of actually changing the view over time, but it's a powerful enough subset we're going to talk about that. And then we'll actually talk about, well, explicitly reducing the number of attributes, which is very tied into navigation in terms of slicing and cutting and projection, which again are probably ideas that you've seen before. So let's talk about changing over time. Well, one of the most obvious ways to change over time is to actually pick a different visual encoding. It's not the case that a single visual encoding is always the right answer. I've already mentioned the idea that it can depend on both data and tasks. A lot of systems allow you to just change the visual encoding. Tableau is one particular example that I happen to be using, where what they're doing is taking a same base data set and changing the visual encoding. Notice how in what they've done here is they've gone from a simple bar chart to one where they've actually moved to stacked bars. Then they're actually picking one that's geographic, where they're using some of the data that they weren't showing in a previous one. So these are different visual representations because they pick different visual encodings. So what else could you do? You could take essentially the same visual encoding and then change the way you're ordering the data. So here's an example, a system called Lineup from folks at Harvard and among other places. And so what they have is these data tables that have multiple attributes, and they want to say, what if I used different weighted combinations of these attributes? How do different things actually end up in a ranking? And so a thing to notice here is that reordering the data is actually going to give you different visual insights. So here they've ordered according to basically one weighted combination of attributes versus another one versus another one. They're actually showing these, they're either called bump charts or slope graphs, sort of connections between the different rankings of a particular, this is in fact Princeton University, so they're showing school orderings based on different criteria with these weighted attributes. So you can, the point in general is, given that spatial position is such a strong cue, choosing how to order things based on, say, attribute values can give a very strong sense of what's in the data. So a lot of interfaces essentially give you the same visual encoding but allow you to reorder, particularly by things like choosing which of attributes, if you've got some kind of tabular view, to use for the ordering. What's another thing you can do that's different? You can say, well, what if you want to realign? And from the same system, one thing to notice, this is a stacked bar chart where you've got little subsections of this bar. It's really divided into this glyph with multiple marks. With a stacked bar, it's easy to compare the entire length of the bar here, and it's easy to compare that first one in the stack, these red regions. It's actually pretty hard to compare the green regions because they're not aligned. So in an interactive system, you can actually just change, well, give me a different alignment point. And now what you can easily compare is the length of the blue versus the length of the green. It's no longer so easy to compare the full bar or the first one. So that's an example of, it's basically the same visual encoding, but you've just interactively changed the alignment. What else can we do? Well, any kind of an animation is a change over time. So one of the pieces of wisdom that we have understood from a lot of empirical tests is animated transitions from one state to another tends to be pretty powerful support as opposed to a simple jump cut of changing from one to the other. Because the problem, if I said, well, here we've got a matrix view, this is actually looking at the hierarchical structure of a software package. If I want to change from this view to that view, and I do a jump cut from here to there, it's pretty hard to track objects between that. You have to somehow decide, well, things in this view, how do they correspond to that view? I could tell you, well, this part is expanded to become the entire section, but it's pretty hard to track. So in a system where you have support, where you maybe have about 1 second of a multiple frame animation from one state to the other, we can start to see, okay, this blue part is getting larger and larger. We're gradually fading in some more details here, so we can actually see the substructure here start to emerge. So an animated transition for any kind of navigation or any kind of transition can actually be a pretty powerful way to help people see it in more detail. So there's definitely some power if you're going to animate a transition from one phase to the other. We'll talk in just a minute about why animation is not always the right answer for everything. But I do want to mention that selection is something that is useful to think about. In general, often when you're interacting, you have this idea of saying, what's the target of my interaction? I need to somehow select. It might not be obvious that there's actually some complexity here. So as you're designing software, like, how many selection types could there be? If you've got a mouse, you often want a different semantics for clicking on something versus simply hovering the mouse over it. You might even have a different semantics for hovering and pausing versus just moving very quickly. In some cases, you might actually want some kind of semantics like a source and a target, so there might be really two different things you're trying to somehow select. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is the idea of highlighting separately from selection. And this is going to come up a lot as we talk about having multiple views and linking between them. So one way to highlight is actually just to, for example, change the color of an object. So when you click on it, it turns red, which is great, except for it turning red actually obliterated whatever color coding you had before. So sometimes if you actually want to keep the previous color coding, you have to think about alternatives to a specific highlight color. One thing you could do is outline. You could use other channels, like having them move around a bit. You could even actually add connection marks explicitly linking the selected items. And one thing you'll need to think about is actually, even at the software architecture level, if you're trying to design for scalability, and you think about how it is that you could communicate between two different views what was selected, It's easy if only a few items are selected. If your views could have millions of items in it, and you just did a selection that actually selected 500,000 items at once, you might want to be careful about whether you're actually shipping over 500,000 pieces of data in between the views. So there's a lot of interesting architectural issues with selection and highlighting that aren't obvious if you're just thinking about clicking on things and having them light up. What about navigation? So this is basically a change of the viewpoint. And what's interesting about it is, in some sense, it's also reducing the data that's shown because you're changing how many items you can see. You're using this metaphor that there is some world and there is a camera, and you're actually moving that camera just like you would move a movie camera in the real world. So with zooming, one way to do zooming is to exactly do what a camera would do. And what cameras do is they have some kind of geometric zoom. You can get closer to something, further away from something. There's actually a relationship between zooming of a lens and translating the camera back. So we call this geometric zooming in visualization. There's also some interesting ways to think about zooming that are non-literal, that don't just copy what a camera would do. And one of the more interesting ones is what's called semantic zooming, which is to do something smart about representing the object based on the number of pixels that are available to you. And you could either have something that's quite a dramatic change or a more subtle one. I'm actually going to skip ahead to this slide to give you an example. Here's a system actually out of some of our own work in my lab called LiveRack, where the size of the box determines what kind of a graph is drawn within it. And if you've got a pretty large box, then you're doing what you're used to seeing. It's a full-on line graph. There's multiple lines superimposed. There's axes. There's tick marks. There's labels and all that. If you've got considerably less room, then we're just drawing something much simpler, a so-called spark line, where you really just have this sort of very simple iconic version of a graph. We're just marking a min and a max point. And if you have really very little room, then we don't even try to show a graph. We're just showing color, where we've got some color-coded stuff to say, essentially, this is system management data for looking at time series for in a web hosting company to try to say, is this system actually about to fall over and crash? And so we just really want to highlight the dangerous ones in red. So the point being that this decision about how to draw this is made by the system automatically based on the size of the box. It's not just trying to take this full complex chart and do something useful with it if you only have a few pixels of height and of width, because you would just basically see sort of a mishmash. So having something where you dramatically change how you're drawing it based on the amount of room you have can actually give you quite a bit of power, rather than simply saying, I'll do what a camera does, and when it gets small enough, it'll just be sort of an indistinguishable blur. There's stuff we can do better by trying to say, let's be more specific. Coming back to more general navigation, there's also any kind of panning. In 3D, often that's called translating rather than panning. Usually we don't do a lot of rotation in 2D, but it's extremely common and useful if you're doing any kind of a 3D view. So this direct pan, zoom, rotate camera metaphor, it's typically intuitive, it's powerful, and it directly changes what you can see in the view in a way that's typically easy to understand. So where are some of its limits? Well, it turns out that none of us are actually fantastic at flying airplanes or helicopters straight out of the boat. We require a lot of training to actually effectively operate a helicopter, because in fact people, although we live in some sense in a 3D world, we very much are used to navigating on a ground plane. So offering people just completely unconstrained navigation in 3D is often somewhat difficult for people to achieve their goals. Often it's the case that giving some kind of constraints on the navigation, like don't just make them do full-on translate, zoom, and rotate, but say something like, this spot right here is of interest. And so what I want to do is automatically compute a trajectory that actually arcs around and say has my viewpoint going from here down into here in a way that's perpendicular and easy to see and centers the part I care about, say, in my view. So this kind of computing of a trajectory in response to a user selection can give you a lot of power in terms of constrained navigation with those animated transitions that I mentioned before. So I mentioned this metaphor of a camera. This is particularly useful when you think about the combination of attributes in cameras. Because if you continue with this camera metaphor and you think, what could we do with, say, 3D or 4D or more data, then we can think about this metaphor of slicing and cutting and projecting. And I'm showing examples from medical imaging, but these could just as well be astrophysical, where one of the things people can think about easily is a slice of the data. Often the data is actually measured through slices in some cases. So you might want to say, let me have some slicing plane. That's essentially saying I'm going to fix the value of one attribute, and I want to see everything from that value. In some cases, computationally, it can be very easy to allow only axis-aligned slices if that's how you gathered the data. But a more complex issue is you might want to allow an arbitrary alignment of a slice that doesn't necessarily match the acquisition of that data set. Cut is basically a version of slicing where you're saying, don't just give me that slice. I want to actually keep everything on the other side of that slice, but throw away everything between that slice and the camera viewpoint. So that would be as in this example here. And then there's the question of projection. So with slicing, you've fixed an attribute. You've basically said, I'm setting the attribute to this. With projection, there are many ways to project. Obviously, all of you here doing a lot of astrophysics have thought a lot about different projection systems. There are certainly a bunch of well-known ones. There's things out of geography, things like Mercator and other projections. There's some drafting style projections like Cabinet and Cavalier. And then, of course, there's a lot of the astrophysical ones. So there are many ways to basically project down from a higher number of dimensions to a lower number. And I think of all of these as alternatives to slicing and cutting. So these are some of the major families of ways to navigate through that data. Lots more about this, if you're curious. But I'm going to move along to actually say, given that changing over time is the obvious thing to do, what are the less obvious things to do? And why might we ever do them? So faceting into multiple views is one of the cases that's maybe less obvious, but has actually quite a lot of power. So both having multiple views side by side or juxtaposed, how would we actually partition the data between views? When would we want to superimpose two layers on top of each other to create a view? So let's think about some of these, starting with this question of having views side by side, and what power does that give you, and what decisions do you have to make? So for example, you could have two views that have different ways to visually encode the same data set. Or you might actually have the same way to visually encode. And in particular, we'll talk about this power of having a linked highlight between those two views. You could think of what is shared between the views. Is all the data the same? Is one showing a subset of the data? Or do they have no data in common? And finally, if you move in one of those views, do you also have bidirectional linking where you move in the other? So do you have shared navigation between them? So let's look at some examples. Linked highlighting is actually arguably one of the real success stories. Almost every time you have multiple views, there is power in having linked highlighting between them. And that power comes because you're seeing how something that's contiguous in one view may or may not be spatially contiguous in the other view. So let's look at this. This is actually an example from baseball stats. And we've got some histograms and scatter plots and so on. And what we've done here is we're seeing the same data across multiple different views. So we've got different visual encodings of the same data set. And what we've done here is we've actually highlighted, this is log scale salary, and we've highlighted the people that get paid a lot. And we're starting to ask questions like, so what about the distribution of seniority? This is the number of years they've been playing. Okay, that's pretty distributed. What about the number of assists versus putouts? Okay, well, that's actually pretty distributed too. It's also distributed across different positions on the field. But one thing we do notice a correlation is that this is the number of hits per year, and the high hitters are in the highly paid category. Not all the high hitters, but at least all the highly paid people hit well. So what we're able to see is this region that's contiguous in one, where does it fall in the others? So anytime you're thinking about taking something static and adding interactivity to it, in general, the very first thing I counsel you to do is add linked highlighting between those views, because that's really what gives you the power of interactivity. When you select something in one view, where does it fall in the other? Sometimes that can be software architecturally a challenge. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. What else could you do? Well, you could have the same visual encoding between two views where what you're doing is selecting a subset. So here's an example you've all probably seen. It's a geographic view. And what we're seeing is, in this case, it's a smaller bird's eye map of the whole thing. And there's a depiction of this zoomed in region here. So you're able to maintain orientation as you're doing things like panning. As you get more and more zoomed in, it's easy to lose context. But this view actually gives you that context. So you're able to keep context with one view while you're moving around to see the details in the other. This so-called overview in detail is a very, very common idiom as well. In this case, we've also got the shared navigation. As you move this around, this view updates and vice versa. So what else could we do? Here's an example where the buzzword in visualization is small multiples. And in this case, we have the same visual encoding, but we don't have the same data. We're actually partitioning the data so that we're seeing different things in views. This is coming back to that example I showed you at the very beginning of looking at the gene expression data, where what we're doing is we're using the same spatial layout of this node-link graph, but we're using different values for different experimental conditions at these different time points. And so we see these differences in color coding, and we're able to actually look back and forth between them. This one also happens to have bidirectional navigation shared between the views. So let's think about the pros and cons of showing this as these small multiple views versus what might be the obvious thing, which is animation. Because these experimental conditions happen to be at multiple time points. So why didn't we just show this as an animation? And let me see. And let me actually jump forward to this. So one problem with showing things as an animation is it's very hard to keep track of what's going on if you have a lot of disparate changes all over in the view. I can look at this one and say, okay, orange, white, red, great. And I have no idea what happened in the entire rest of the view. It's very hard to track. A lot of people have the intuition that animation should be obvious because, after all, animation is this incredibly powerful medium for telling stories, and we all see Disney movies, and we understand them. What they might not realize is that the Disney animators have spent an enormous amount of energy and time making sure that your eyes are looking in the right place and that one thing happens at a time. And that's typically not true for general data sets, where change could be happening all over the view. So it's not always the case that simply animating data is the right answer. Sometimes it's the case that it might actually be better to show these small multiples rather than just show animations. The thing to keep in mind is, although you might have a data set where there is change over time intrinsically in the data, the human brain treats change over time quite differently than the use of space. So there's an asymmetry in the way we perceive things that means you might make different choices than the obvious one, which is to show temporally changing data as an animation. That special case of animated transitions is reasonable because you're going from one state to another rather than having a lot of intermediate frames. This is actually a small number of points over only 8 frames, and it's still hard to track. So going back to those small multiple views, let's actually think about our choices. So we can have the same visual encoding or a different one, and we could have all or some or none of the data in common. And actually, 2 of these 6 cases are boring for opposite reasons. If you've got all the same data and all the same visual encoding, then they're completely redundant, and there's really no point. These cases of either different visual encodings, you can do that for this subsetting. These overview detail views can work either for the same encoding or for different encodings. We talked about that small multiples case, but if you've got completely different data and the visual encoding is completely different, then there's actually no way to link those 2 views, and that's why it's less interesting. So the interesting question about juxtaposing views is, why are we doing this? What are the cognitive benefits? And what it comes down to is that we're prioritizing your eyes moving back and forth between the views versus the memory. Because it turns out that it's much lower load to move your eyes between views than it is to compare what you see before you to what you remember seeing in the past. Because that use of memory is what actually causes cognitive load. So there is this benefit to just being able to move your eyes. So if multiple views are so great, how come we ever do anything else? And the answer is, well, we have a limited number of pixels. So as soon as you go to multiple views, you're suddenly reducing the number of pixels available for any single view, and there's very, very, very strong limits on that. So a lot of the interesting viz design is built about thinking about this trade-off space between when you have more than one view and how much change do you allow in a view in terms of giving some kind of support for memory, while keeping in mind that we run out of pixels almost faster than anything else. Pixels are precious. They're even more precious than human attention. And so we run out of them very quickly in designing a visualization. So we already talked about why not animation as opposed to, say, multiple views. Here's an example of quite an ambitious system with a lot of linked views. This is probably pushing the limits on the number of windows you can usefully process at the same time. It's actually an open research question about how many views you can get away with, and the answer is, it depends. Certainly more than 2, certainly less than 100. This is perhaps nearing the limits of that. But one interesting thing that I will point out with these multiple view systems, this is actually a system that's merging some geographic data, some non-spatial data. You see there's a lot going on with parallel coordinates and scatter plots and overview detailed geographic views. But what might not have been obvious, there is a lot of value in these simple list views that are perhaps reorderable when they are linked to other views. Because what you can do with a simple linked list is actually look stuff up easily and find it. Whereas, if you actually know the name of the state and you're looking for that on the scatter plot, it can be hard to find. If you've got an alphabetized list, it's very easy to click. So a lot of the power of these list views come when they're in a linked context rather than just being solo. So it's always something to think about is when can you either support search explicitly by giving them a search box or by giving them another view in which it's easy to find the thing they care about, but they also want to see that in the context of maybe some of these other views that are more abstract. So we've talked about the idea that there's power in views that are side by side, but how do you decide how to split things into those views? And so what is actually happening when we're using multiple views? There's something a bit deep here in terms of cognition. What we're doing is we're splitting into spatial regions according to some attribute value. And the thing I mentioned near the beginning was that spatial proximity is this really, really, really strong cue. And so what we're getting is the idea that the way you split things into views has this very strong implication on what patterns people see, because of the fact that basically spatial proximity overrides a lot of the other perceptual cues. And let me just mention a vocabulary point. I'm talking a lot about views, and then sometimes I've mentioned this word glyph. And in fact, a scatter plot, is that just a simple glyph or is it a view? And the answer is it depends. I'm just thinking about actually more generally regions of space. If they're big enough, then you often show something in great detail. If they're very small, you can think about this as essentially being internal structure on a mark. So something like a stacked bar in a stacked bar chart, you can think of as a glyph, but something like a scatter plot or a bar chart could either be a glyph or a view, depending on how much visual complexity you're allowing, just based on the number of pixels. So coming back to this question of partitioning, let's think about the power of 2 different ways to look at the same data set. This is a simple demographic data set across about 6 states. And so one thing we could do is we could first split by the state into regions, and then within each region we can draw something relatively complex, which is this grouped bar. Essentially it's a glyph with these grouped bars. What's easy to do in this view is make comparisons within the state. We can start to notice, oh, there's roughly this similar pattern with the age groups across all 6 states. So that's an easy comparison to make. It's harder to compare exactly what's happening with the 45 to 64-year-old demographics. In contrast, if you want to first split into these demographic categories, and then within each one you say, okay, what shall I do? Actually, within each one of these I can just do a simple bar chart, because now within each demographic I can just have one bar for each state. You see a very different view of the data. And in this case, it's very easy to make these comparisons within each age, and then it's a bit more perceptual work to actually try to compare between states. So the question of how you partitioned between the views controls the visual pattern that you can see. It's a very, very strong cue. Let's look at the same principle with a more interesting data set instead of a very simple bar chart. This is all the houses that were bought within the City of London over a couple of years. So it's a complex multi-attribute table. And so what did we do in this case? We first took this data set and we split by neighborhood. So these words here, if any of you know your London geography, are London neighborhoods: Harrow, Bromley, Ealing. Then what we did is we split by the type of the house. So an apartment, basically flats, terraced housing, semi-detached and detached, what we would think of here as just a standard house sitting alone in a yard. So those are, within each of these, we've repeated this partition. Then by time, we're saying that the years are the rows and the months are the columns. And then we're color coding according to the price of the house. So what can we see in this split? You immediately start to see where do the rich people live. That's where all the expensive houses are. And you also can start to see things like where is there a large differential between a detached house and an apartment, because you can notice these patterns of, for example, here's something that's very expensive for detached, not so much for the apartments. So you can start to see some of these differential patterns about spatial neighborhoods. What if we did a different partition? In this case, what we did is we first split according to the house type, flats or semi-detached or terraced or completely detached, and then within each of these, we're doing that split by neighborhood. We've actually switched the color coding to the variation of the price rather than the absolute price. And now what you could see is, let's say you had decided already you knew what kind of a place you wanted to buy. You could see when is there a real inconsistency with the neighborhoods in a way that was harder to see in the others. So the point of this example is that ordering of the partition between the views has a very strong effect on the spatial patterns that people see, and those are the most salient part. So what else could we do? Just to point out that this is not just about rectilinear boxes. Here's an example where we've actually got choropleth maps within each of these rather than just those simple tree map style views. Actually, those of you who noticed might notice that there's a kind of quasi-geographic layout for these, where they were careful to make sure to preserve some ordering relationships between the way they laid out these neighborhoods and the actual geographic view. What else could we do? We could start playing around where we actually say, okay, what if we size each region by some count, in this case the number of things sold, and the result is actually one of those views that we saw before when we were talking about networks, of a tree map style view. So where we're actually showing some amount of stuff with size, area, and containment as well. So this is all just to get you thinking about what are some of the powerful things you can do with partitioning into spatial regions. One last bit when we're thinking about views and layers, which is what about putting views on top of each other, about superimposing them? And so in particular, I'm just going to call a layer any set of objects that are spread out. And a question is, how much can you get away with? So how many layers can people use? How do you distinguish between them? So in general, if you're doing something that's completely static, you can only really have a very small number of layers. If you're doing anything where you've got interaction, then things can get more complicated. So it's pretty easy to visually create a foreground versus a background layer. If you're really careful, you can maybe get away with 3 layers, but you are not going to be easily able to distinguish, say, 20 layers from each other in a view. You're going to hit the scalability limits on that. Let's look at a static example. Geographic maps are usually a great example of very careful layering. So the thing to notice in this view is actually there really are 2 layers. There's this highly saturated, high luminance contrast foreground, which are basically the roads. And then there are these sort of desaturated background layers. Remember how we said large regions should be desaturated? If this ocean were bright blue, it would sort of blow your eyes out, but it's a much more desaturated blue. And so you're able to see these other distinctions between parks and ocean and land. So one thing to notice is that with this kind of visual layering, a lot of stuff is happening with luminance contrast. So there's a handy motto out of graphic design of get it right in black and white, where if you're doing a lot with color, you want to make sure you're using luminance effectively to make sure that they're getting the fine-grained detail. So it's often useful to literally just cut out the color channel and see how much of your visual encoding is still comprehensible. So that's a handy rule of thumb. So this question of how many layers is too many, it might be a different answer if you just have that special case of line charts. So let's look, because this is something that may well actually come up for you. If you just have a small number of lines, you can all put them on top of each other and life is fine. And at some point, things go to heck. and all you can see are the outliers, and most of the structure is just completely superimposed. So there's too much occlusion. So an interesting question would be, well, when do you stop? When do you switch from simply layering things to maybe doing something more like these small multiple views? So there's been some empirical work on this, where they actually did a study about comparing if you've got one larger line chart with superimposed lines versus several smaller small multiples, because you want to actually take into account that you're using up your pixels. And what they found was it depended on the task. That for local kinds of tasks, you could get away with more than for these global tasks. And so with these kind of global tasks, like trying to find things like where's the area of maximum slope, at some point you actually started to need to switch over into small multiples. Whereas some very local tasks, like at a given time point, which of these is the highest value, you could actually do that much more with these layered line charts. So there starts to be some advice on when to go back and forth between layers and multiples, but there's still a lot that we're not quite sure of. But it's just useful to think explicitly about how many layers can you effectively use before you've got so much occlusion that you can't see what's going on. One last thing about layering, it's useful to think about dynamic layers. Here's an example in a node-link graph layout system where the mouse is over one node, and then what's automatically highlighted is all of the one-hop neighbors away from that node. And so you can actually have quite a complex picture that you can interactively navigate and see different parts of it lighting up in a way that actually allows you to handle a fair amount of visual complexity. It's often very useful with that kind of interaction to do something very, very lightweight, where simply as you move the mouse around, you see these different patterns lighting up. So that's an example where the layering is completely dynamic. It's not static ahead of time. It's dynamic based on some interactive selection. So that was a bit of thinking about how to handle multiple views. Again, lots more reading on that. Are there any questions about this one? Okay. So now let's talk about this idea of data reduction, of filtering and aggregating. So what do I mean by that? So when we're reducing the number of items and attributes, well, for one thing, let me just point out that when I say reduce, I actually mean both inverses. I mean both reduce or increase. So typically in an interactive context, we're somehow controlling the data complexity, whether we're increasing or reducing. These are the inverse cases of each other. Now, in some deep sense, filtering is the obvious thing to do. Filter means you throw some things away. You just don't show them. What's nice about filtering is it's straightforward and it's intuitive, and it's both intuitive to explain to the user what you just did, and it can often have fantastic computational results because you usually reduce the size of the data set you're computing on. So it can actually be very computationally advantageous to filter as well. So if filtering is so great, why do we ever do anything else? And the answer is this rather terrible state of affairs where out of sight, out of mind is actually almost literally true in terms of how humans act. So you have this problem that the user themselves just 30 seconds ago clicked the little checkbox to say don't draw this. And yet, they almost can't help it. They will start, once they do that, and then they're seeing the reduced complexity thing, they will actually start drawing conclusions, forgetting about the rest of the data that they're not currently seeing. It's a very strong cognitive principle that people tend to systematically forget about things they're not just directly seeing with their own eyes. So while filtering can have a lot of power, it's not always the perfect answer. It can be often useful to give them some visual indication, both so they're actively thinking about it and so they're not relying on their memory, which, as we've talked about, imposes cognitive load. So filtering is something you can either do based on items or based on attributes. What is the alternative? Because remember, we're still talking about cases where the data set is too complex to show everything at once. So aggregation is my catch-all term for this alternative to filtering, where you're somehow having a proxy that stands in for a large set of things that you're not drawing. And so what's nice is you're not simply throwing away everything. You're representing what's not shown with some proxy representation. The great thing is it can be very powerful. Of course, the hard thing is that the devil is in the details. How do you aggregate in such a way that you haven't averaged out the entire signal that you're trying to show? So a lot of the nuances and subtleties comes in an interactive way about figuring out how to usefully aggregate for this information that you have, which is often some interactively chosen subset or slice. This is the point where I do want to say that these two techniques are not mutually exclusive. It's extremely common to have combinations of filtering and aggregation. In fact, none of these four techniques, these larger ones for handling complexity, are mutually exclusive. It's really common to both, in a complex situation, to do deriving and reducing data and changing a view over time and fastening across multiple views. A lot of systems actually combine all four of these strategies. So you don't have to pick just one. Just like with filtering, aggregation can either be on items or on attributes. So let's actually look at a few examples of those as well. Relatively simple idea. The buzzword for that is dynamic filtering, but this is an example of filtering based on items. Here's a scatter plot looking at a whole bunch of movies. It's obviously, it would be far too busy to show the titles for every one of these small dots. Here we've got something where they're actually setting some sliders where they're, and it's in fact it's an alphabetical slider where they're saying, once I filter down to only show movies with a single actor in, well, now I have some hope of actually showing the labels usefully on this display where we haven't changed the spatial position of anything, we've just filtered out most of those dots. So although it sounds like a fairly straightforward idea, let me mention that one of the nice things about doing this stuff with interactive visualization rather than just a query that you type in is you can sort of very easily start to see when do I have a query that basically is too many, it gets me most or all of the data set, versus the query that's too few, often like 0 items returned. It can be difficult to just query these, whereas any kind of an interactive interface where you go from seeing everything to interactively and gradually filtering down to fewer gives you some sense of essentially doing the equivalent of query refinement very, very, very quickly, given that contextual information. You could also do things like filter on the attributes. Here's an example of these. Sometimes they're called radar glyphs or star glyphs, where every one of these radial spikes outward is actually showing a dimension. So it's a radial way of showing high-dimensional data. But if you try to show too many dimensions, you just see these sort of Rorschach blobs, where you can't actually see enough of the structure because there's more of these dimensions than you can actually visually distinguish. So this unfiltered view is not super interesting if you've got several hundred dimensions in your data set. If you had a useful way to try to filter out, maybe you try to find the least similar attributes to each other, or do some other ways maybe of sorting, and then you choose only a small number of the attributes to actually show, now we've actually got these glyphs that show much more comprehensible shapes. So by filtering out most of the attributes and only showing about a dozen instead of a few hundred, you're actually able to see useful structure. So filtering is something you can do both for items and for attributes. Now, what about aggregation? I'm going to start with a simple example that I know you've all thought about, which is a histogram, and I just want to present it in this context of the vocabulary I'm using to talk. I think of this as an example of static aggregation of items, and it's directly aimed at the task of finding a distribution across that attribute. So the point I want to make is you start out with a table of data, and you construct derived data where actually, in this new table, you've got a specific number of bins, and the values in that table are the counts of the number of items in the original one that fall into that range. It's worth pointing out that the bin size is pretty crucial, and depending on this discretization level that you choose, you might see dramatically different patterns. And one place where interaction could actually be very useful is allow people to just interactively on the fly control that bin size to see how that visual pattern changes. But my main point was I was thinking about this as a static aggregation idiom. What can we do that's a somewhat more interesting use of aggregation? Before I get to that, in too much detail, I do want to mention there's a buzzword which might be counterintuitive called scented widgets. You might wonder, what's that? It's actually the idea of information sent out of Xerox PARC, where they talked about information foraging behavior as something that was an analog to what animals do when they look for food. It's what humans do in a sense-making task when they're trying to find information in these huge document data sets. So the point of this, in fact, is to try to show people ahead of time what would happen if I interacted. Because a lot of the danger of interaction is that it can degenerate into human-powered search. You don't want the poor human to have to go systematically move every slider every time to all positions to try to synthesize some view of what would happen. So this idea of augmenting simple widgets with a very small and concise visualization showing them what would happen if they moved the slider. So by far the most popular of these scented widgets is basically adding a histogram onto every slider you can. What's interesting about it is it basically is adding some visualization capabilities to what you would normally think about as a control panel, not the visualization itself. So although it's possible to do this kind of information sent for others as well, what's really caught on is this idea of histograms on your sliders. So it's something you might think about as a way to actually introduce more information into the control panel than you might think. In fact, just to help people predict what would happen when they move the sliders. So in general, you often want to think about providing visual feedback to show people where might be an interesting place to explore next. So when you provide navigation, how do you help them decide where to navigate? And anytime you have interaction, you want to give them as much guidance as possible to not just make them have to systematically look through every possible combination. Before we end with the static item aggregation, let me mention the box plot. This is another example where it's aimed at finding distribution, and you're also making essentially a derived table of data. In this case, there's 5 carefully chosen statistical attributes that are actually showing then things like the median, the lower and upper quartiles, and then these fences beyond which everything is counted as an outlier. The point I want to make here is actually a scalability point, that the box plot takes the same amount of screen real estate whether you're showing it about 20 items or 1 million items. Both box plots and histograms are a way of actually guaranteeing the amount of screen space you need to show some part of your data set, and it's doing that explicitly by aggregating. So aggregating can be this way of actually giving quite a bit of power, only as I mentioned, a lot of the complex questions come down to, oh, but how do we do that in a useful way? The box plot is one long proposed and popular way of doing that. What are some of the ways we could do that kind of thing in a dynamic way that is interactive? So here's an example where that parallel coordinate idiom that I mentioned earlier has been extended to try to do something useful as the data set gets too big. So I mentioned that it's scaled up to maybe a few hundred items, and then at some point if you're trying to show tens of thousands of lines, it's hopeless. They're all overplotted. There's too much occlusion. This approach uses actually a more general principle of saying, let's take our data set and run some kind of hierarchical clustering on it, and then let people look at those top few clusters and interactively decide how many clusters do you want to see. So if you cluster the entire data set all the way up to the root, then you can start to see, well, here's this proxy line showing you what the sort of root node in this hierarchical cluster looks like, and we're explicitly showing the extents with these sort of gradually fading off of lines. As you change the slider to say, now show me a few more of the top level clusters, you start to see these regions of uncertainty, of range, actually get a bit tighter, and we start to see more visual structure. At some point, this is probably the limit of what we can usefully see, where we're seeing maybe the top dozen or so clusters. But this is actually a data set of tens of thousands of parallel coordinate lines, and we're able to see a reasonable amount of its structure. Now, in this case, the color coding is just showing what's near versus far to each other in the hierarchy. So it's not so much trying to show direct categorical information as it is just showing roughly are things distant or far. But this general idea of take a complex data set, run some kind of hierarchical clustering on it, and then allow the user to interactively navigate within that clustering is not just for parallel coordinates. It's a more general idea that a fair amount of the interactive and dynamic aggregation techniques all have in common, is do something where you've got a complex data set, you want to cluster it, and then navigate between the clusters and show things directly on those. What's another example of attribute aggregation? Well, dimensionality reduction is actually, in my vocabulary, an example of this, where we're somehow trying to go to a low-dimensional target space from some very high-dimensional measured space. I'm curious, actually, how many people in this room have done stuff like PCA or multidimensional scaling or anything like that in terms of their own work so far? So not very common in astrophysics at all. Interesting. There are some domains where there is the assumption that you can't actually directly measure what you care about. You might be able to take a far more verbose measurement. And what you try to do is have a situation where you conjecture that what's really happening, the latent factors that are hidden within the data set, you might be able to actually reveal by trying to reduce, by keeping almost all the variance of the data. You're assuming massive, massive redundancy in what you're able to measure, and trying to actually find some of the hidden structure within. This is actually a place where there's a lot of overlap between visualization, say, and machine learning in terms of techniques. So here's an example where you might be able to have some kind of measurements you could take on a tumor. Maybe that makes a 9-dimensional space of what you were able to measure. And then if you run some of these so-called dimensionality reduction algorithms on them, then what you might notice is even if we didn't have this color coding, this was a priori knowledge we had of which ones were malignant and which were benign, you can actually see, spatially speaking, these two different clusters where you do start to notice that there's a quite different spatial distribution between these. So the typical case where you're using dimensionality reduction is that you don't know in ahead of time which is malignant and which is benign, but you're trying to actually understand something about the structure of that data where you've derived a low-dimensional target space. Let me mention a case where this is used quite a bit. If you've got large document data sets, technically, the way you could think about a document data set is a very, 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 very high-dimensional table. The so-called bag of words model is where you say, let's combine all the documents together and consider every single word that appears anywhere in this entire data set, treat that as a very high-dimensional feature vector, and for each document, you count the number of times the word appears in that document. So what you have is actually a very sparse vector, typically. So here we have this huge high-dimensional table where there's one column for every word across the whole data set. There's one row for each document. There is no value for the user in directly seeing that table. Where there starts to be value is if you say, well, let us derive a new data set where we've gone from this high-dimensional space to a much lower dimensional space. We're going to cluster down. We're going to reduce to just 2 dimensions. And then we're going to plot scatter plots and try to see, do we see useful cluster structure? And if so, we might actually try to read a subset of those documents, try to understand what that cluster is about, maybe add some kind of annotation or label to it. So that's an example of going from a much higher dimensional space down to a lower dimensional space where you conjecture that there really is this kind of possible cluster structure in the space of all documents. So again, more to read about all that. Now, at this point, oh, sorry, that was a undone slide. Rather than talking about embedding, which is a particular combination of filtering and aggregation, I was explicitly wanting to save some time for questions and answers. So I believe I have about 15 minutes left, which was my goal. If it turns out there's no questions, there's more for me to rant about, but I've been ranting for a long time. So let's see if there's any questions folks have.